Welcome everyone. How you all doing on this fine Friday morning or afternoon, depending on where you're at. Feel free to drop us a line in the chat. Love to hear from you, hear how you're doing. John, welcome. Howdy, howdy. Very excited to have Russell with us today. He's going to share all sorts of fun things about crafting a vivid world that our readers want to live in, and I cannot wait to hear from him. He's got a great presentation lined up for us. Now, as usual, this presentation is being recorded, okay, and it will be available after the fact. We'll try to get that up in the webinar library next Monday, so watch out for that. But I'm really excited to have everyone here. I can see everyone jumping in here. Haiti, welcome. John H, welcome. Marius, good to see you back here again. Thanks. John from Cape Cod, good to see you. Renee from El Paso, Texas. Actually, I have some family there right now, actually, Renee. That's kind of cool. Tajart from South Africa, good to see you. Nana, welcome. Catherine, back from Austin, good to see you again. Kitty, good to see you again. Cabral, welcome. Yeah, we got a great presentation lined up for you guys today. Haiti, you're from Egypt. Wow, that's exciting. I'm always excited to see the places people are from and from all over the world here. It's always great to see that. Welcome. Chandrell, if I mispronounce your name, please forgive me. Welcome. Looks like we got some new faces here, some new names rather. I don't recognize all these people. This is great. Floaty, good to have you back. And so if this is your first time, give me a shout out. Love to hear if this is your first time here. That's great. If you've been here before, I see you. I recognize you. Happy you're back. We are going to have a fantastic session today. Calvin, good to see you again from Soggy, Chattanooga. And William from Tennessee. Excellent. Okay, well, we'll give everyone just a couple more minutes to jump in here before we get started. And then we'll get the ball rolling here. And as a reminder to everyone, this is being recorded. So if you end up coming in late or you have to duck out a little early, that's okay. You can catch that replay. We'll get all those wonderful resources and everything for you as well. Let's see here if I'm missing anything. Let me pull up my notes, make sure I'm not forgetting something. But I think we're pretty well ready to go here. So I will go ahead and start us off with a quick introduction to Simon, and then once we do that, we will be on our way.
I am Russell.
Oh, sorry,
Not
Simon.
Simon.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I keep mixing up names. I apologize, Russell. Thank you, Russell. Apologize about that. But happy Russell's here. So let me tell you a little bit about Russell. So Russell is a USA Today best-selling fantasy author who has written dozens of novels and graphic novels, including The Gods Verse Chronicles, The Obsidian Spindle Saga, and Ichabod Jones Monster Hunter. He is the publisher of Wannabe Press, co-host of the Kickstart Your Book Sales and Six-Figure Author Experiments podcast, and co-founder of the Writer MBA Conference and the Future of Publishing Mastermind. He also co-created the author ecosystem archetype system to help authors embrace their natural tendencies to find success. And you can find most of his writing at theauthorstack.com, and he lives in Los Angeles with his wife and dogs. Well, welcome, Russell. We're excited to have you here. I'm going to go ahead and turn the time over to him and let him go.
Awesome. So I'm going to apologize right now. Usually I'm quite a bit more animated, but I am very sick from NINC. So I'm trying to conserve my energy. Just assume I'm like actually 20 to 50% more excited than I am right now. But like this is as unfroggy as my throat gets. Also, if you want to get all of the the QR code is to my link tree. It has all of the stuff, including where you can get the first book of the Gods Verse Chronicles Magic. So today we're going to do something that I don't get to do a lot. I get to talk about craft, and even though I'm pretty well known for Kickstarter and Substack and author ecosystems and our conference and helping authors do business strategy. First and foremost, I'm an author and I am mainly a fantasy author. And so I have a lot to say about setting and worlds. So I'm I'm going to take it all the way back to the very, 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 very beginning and just talk about what setting is, in case you've never done a book or at all, or you haven't even thought about it. But like, setting in the world is where your book takes place. Um, every different location, for the purposes of this, every different location in your book is its own setting. So, um, if you go from Earth to Mars, there are two different settings. The spaceship is also a setting. If you go to if you have a town, the your house is a setting, another person's house is a setting, the car is a setting. I grew up in movies and TV, and so we're very like when we do a cost breakdown, we look at every little slug of where they are as its own different place. Where it is during the day or night can be a different place. But to visualize all of this world, it's to me, it's helpful to say, hey, if I'm going from downstairs to upstairs, that's a different setting. If I'm going to walk through it, it's not a setting. But if I'm going to we called it settling. So like if we settle in a location, then like that's a different setting. Um, so those are settings, and then the overall world is what we're building all together, and there can be multiple worlds as well. So like we talked about Earth and Mars. Those are two different settings, but they're also probably two different worlds. I can't imagine where it would not be two different worlds. Um, but like the overall world in the universe is basically where your characters live. And then we're going to use the decisions that we make to highlight or de-emphasize all of the rest of our settings and building decisions. So it's important to note that everything you do in every setting that you're in builds the world. It's like everything you do is world building. Like if dogs are green in your world, like there's world building. If like this, if people say hiya when you walk down the street, like that's world building. So every little bit of this influences the world. I find that a lot of especially newbie authors, um, they try to only do one thing in a scene or one thing in a chapter, but the more you can stack together, the more information you'll be able to condense into smaller and smaller packets. Okay, so we're specifically talking about fantasy here, but I know there's always some people that don't do fantasy when I talk about fantasy. So I just want to be clear that like world building happens in romance, in contemporary romance and contemporary thrillers and contemporary mystery. Like settings are important in any kind of book that you have. So while I'm going to be talking mainly about fantasy, I will try to bring um, some other examples in as well. We're going to talk mainly about three different kinds of fantasy, three kinds of worlds. I call it a starter world, a transition world, and then what will be the rest of the world for your story. And like so if you have any questions as we're going through, I probably will stop after each of those three sections and answer any questions that might be relevant, and then we'll answer any other questions at the end. Is that all right with you, Oliver?
Sounds great.
Awesome. Okay, so the most important thing that you can understand about making a fantasy world is that people have a hard time conceptualizing something that is too different from what they know. So the best thing you can do about fantasy is I call it pick your 85%, which is the 85% to 90% of the information that you're going to pick from our world, whether that is fantasy tropes, sci-fi tropes, just the way the world works, that are already known by people that read your kind of genre. Now, you don't need to pick something that like is known by everyone in the world, but at least someone who picks your genre should be able to open your book up and be like, "Yep, I understand what an orc is. I understand what elves are. I understand what like magical swords are. I understand most of what you're talking about." In that, you can then imagine wildly the other 10 to 15% and make it very, very different. One of the biggest reasons that info dumping happens, in my opinion, info dumping is when like you just have pages of pages and pages of explanation, is because we get too far away from what readers know. And so we have to explain way, way, way too much. Now you get a chance to sort of change this up in each of these worlds we're going to talk in, then in every book in your series, and then in every like series that you do to continue to build out things. And there's so much recurrently that audiences know about fantasy that like you can go pretty far afield. But if you think about something like the Dresden Files. The first book is pretty standard urban fantasy, and it gets weirder and weirder and weirder with each book. If we can pick what if we can pick both what people already know and then that 10 to 15% that people are going to be have to really dig deep that like really builds your unique world. Like you will be able to not info dump quite as much. I'm going to show some other ways to not info dump as well. Oh, there's other thing I want to say about this. So if you if someone understands a part of the world, then it is very easy to either use that bit or break that paradigm in a predictable way. So like if vampires are supposed to die in the sun, and everyone knows that, then like having them be shimmery and sparklier in the sun is like a very easy transition for someone to make. Um, Having them become wildly goo monsters is probably like less like known, but you as long as you know what the paradigm is, you can then break or lean into it pretty easily, and people are willing to take that uh, uh, on at face value. The more something is different, the more leaps that someone has to make, the harder that it is for them to make those leaps without a lot of explanation. So this is it is my belief that the world is only exists to challenge the characters and the reader at every turn. So um, the world gives your character something to explore that is new and different, and it should push forward both the internal need of the character and the external want of the character. Basically, it is the physical manifestation of the character's conflict. And like the character, especially in fantasy, should be like the world of the character should be its own character as well. So the world as character is something I believe very strongly in. And when I'm designing my characters and the world, I am definitely trying to decide what friction points in that world will move the character forward as the most. All right, so we're going to move on now to the starting world. But before we do, are there any questions that you see, Oliver, about like the general gist of world building and how I've set this up?
Doesn't look like yet. Let me check the
Okay,
Q&A real quick. Okay, well, actually, there's
cool.
one in the Q&A here. Ellen is asking, is the reader's world also the ordinary world?
Uh, Not necessarily. The read like I mean the ordinary world. Well, I'm actually going to get to that. Okay, so but the ordinary world is where the character starts. I call this the starting world, but like the character might start on Mars or like so like Mars is not the reader's real world. So it can be, but also it's gonna make sense, I think, in a second. So all right. So the first of these three things that you should be thinking about is exactly as you just talked about, the starting world. This is where the characters are, and where they know is familiar. So this is the difference between like is the ordinary world the character's world? it, no, the ordinary world or the starting world is where the characters are familiar, where they understand, where they understand the world, and where you set up how the world works for the character. So, in Lord of the Rings, it's the Shire. Frodo is known in the Shire. Bilbo is known in the Shire. You know that there are hobbits. You know that there is magic. You know that there are wizards. Frodo is not confused by anything that happens in the starting world. We, as readers, might be very confused as to what happens in the starting world, but we're using this initial part of the book to settle the reader and to tell them what is normal. So your main character, or I'm just going to assume you have a single character point of view. You have to do this with each character if you have multiple points of view, but like you are basically introducing your protagonist to the world that they know and how they work with each other. So, for instance, if you have a character who's kind of a fraidy cat, like you would show that in juxtaposition in a minimum of three places. So this is probably one of my best tricks. I learned this from filmmaking, but you want to show your main character in three locations in three different scenes. One is at home, one is at work, and one is at play. So if they're in a bowling league, you could show them at their house, at their place of work, and at their bowling league. And how they interact in each of those places is one of the best ways I have found to center the character on the reader on what kind of character they are. It's also where you show the actual like struggle of the character. Like maybe they want to be more heroic. Maybe they want to have a grand adventure. Like, or maybe they don't want to have a grand adventure and they're forced into it. But like you are basically showing what the status quo is, which is going to be considerably different from what the world is that we're going into. Um, so again, I talk about this in fantasy, but like this can also happen in romance or in contemporary. The starting world is where everything is normal. And then we're going to have an external struggle that happens that puts pressure on them to leave. Um, so we see that Frodo wants to leave, for instance, and Bilbo tells him no. Like this is the juxtaposition of what he wants to do. There is an internal motivation for taking the journey, but then an external force, which is the ring wraiths, come and force them to take action. So in general, I think that there needs to be both an internal motivation that is inside somebody of what they want to do or something that they don't want to do, and then an external factor that pushes them into action. The same thing happens in The Matrix, where you see Neo is in his office. He's deciding what he wants to do, and then the agents come and force him to take action. So we're always playing with the starting world and the status quo, and then what is going to push this character into taking action. It might be they get a call from their mother because they just got an endowment of some spooky house in some weird place. That forces them to go. Maybe they've lost all of their money. Maybe they lose their job, but like some both internal pressure and external factor forces them into action. Um, I really like the idea that in the starting world, like we also are setting the laws of the universe. So I'm going to just take Harry Potter, for example. When before Harry Potter meets Hagrid, he has like everything is about the universe is set up. Like we understand everything about being in England. We understand that there's some sort of magic and weird thing going on. We understand how Harry relates to each character in this starting world, and that he is very much the low man on the totem pole. So we are setting all of the rules for the universe that the reader needs to know. And if we can set them in action instead of setting them in info dumps, then like we're doing two things at once. I wrote this book once called Doom, and I had spent like 20 pages info dumping this new world that I had just built. And my main character and my editor says, you have to fix this. Like, just make her go about her day and learn all of these things as she's going about her day. And it really changed everything for me. So we gave her a hit list, like a literal list of people she had to kill. And like as she was doing it, you learned relationally how everything was going. And yes, there was a little info dumping, but mainly it was mainly we were doing things and learning by doing. Okay, so now we oop, no, no. All right. So once we have set up this world and people understand it, I would say 10 to 15% of your book, no more than 20% of your book. Um, we have to start making the starting world boring or unsafe in some way. We kind of already talked about this a little bit, but like we have to give them we have to give them a reason to leave this boring safe world and travel out to something that's less known. Like maybe they're going from Los Angeles to Tampa or Tampa to Los Angeles, or they're going across across to Mordor or but they're doing it needs to either be too boring for them to continue or better, it needs to be unsafe for them to remain. So they have to make a choice. And once they do, then we're going into the transition world. Does that make sense, Oliver? Like, are we like
Yeah.
this is not dissimilar to probably a lot of world building things that you've had, but like this is how I personally like it makes sense in my head to have all of these things like the starting world. Have I made it safe? Have I explained what how the character relates to the world? Have I decided that have I showed what the character wants? Have I showed the characters that are important to him? Have I shown what's important to him? And then like have I made the goal clear and why they have to move into the next phase of their journey?
Yeah, I think that
Uh,
sounds great. That sounds really good. Yeah, I
awesome.
agree. 100%.
Any questions about this first world that we see before we go to the transition world?
Let's see. Guys, have any questions? Feel free to drop them in the chat or the Q&A regarding the starting world or the ordinary world, however you want to call it. Uh, let's
I
see.
like to think of it like a video game. It's like there's that world where like you're like learning the controls of the video game and you're like doing things and like the but the like the kitty gloves are on. Like they can't really be too like you can't really die too miserably in the starting world. It's not until you start going out of this like very safe area that like things start getting real.
Mhm.
All right, I'm gonna keep going on to this transition world then.
Looks like I got one question for you that just
Okay.
popped up. And so Marius is asking, is info dump bad overall with explaining the second world?
Uh,
Or I guess are you talking about the after the ordinary world? Is that what you're talking about, Marius, when you're jumping after the catalyst? And
I
if,
I have so I would not info dump until you are at least two-thirds of the way through your book. Like you need to build up some trust with readers that they like who you are before you are dumping. Now, I know you're going to be like, Russell, but I love foundations. And like Isaac Asimov does nothing but like info dump for like 800 pages. And like, yes, um, I I can't tell you whether like there are a lot of things in books that are successful that are not best practice. I would say that like the more you can make information happen while a character is experiencing it instead of telling people that like it's going to happen. Like if you stop the character dead and you go, uh, uh, did you know that if you go into that room, you will like have a man scream at you and then like the guy runs away and then like you just go about your day? It's like less satisfying than like the person having to go into the room and getting screamed at and then like so it's like you're doing the same thing. Like the kid the reader is learning the same information, but they are learning it in a much more active way than frankly like pulp novels ever like really like pulp novels were like full of big info dumps and just like I think that the readers are like a little more sophisticated now um
Hmm.
um
Yep.
but yeah so there it you want to teach people information. You don't want to give them homework. In general, readers like to read for enjoyment, not for homework. That is not always true. My wife, for instance, loves homework. And so she loves Isaac Asimov too, because like, of course, like Isaac Asimov gives you homework. Um, so I'm not saying whether to or not do a thing, but like if you can make it so the person experiences it, it would be better. The reason why I say two-thirds of the way through is there might be some bit of information that you need to impart to readers for them to understand the second act turn or the third act that like they just can't experience. Like the plot like the interior of like a place they have to go to like save the princess or something. Like you kind of need the reader to know what that information is, what the plan is, but like you can't have them experience the plan. So sometimes you will have to, and it's just easier to be like, I'm sorry, I'm giving you a 5-page info dump. Like it's happening. This is happening now, but like I've given you 300 pages of not info dumping to like get to this place, and like this, if at all possible, do not info dump. But if you must info dump, make it quick. Um, and make it something that like is critical to the rest of the book. And my editor and I, we edited about 30 books together before she went on to do other things. And that was like, I would put a note, be like, I'm sorry, like, there's literally no other way to do this besides info dumping. And so it might happen, but try to make it not happen. Um, One other thing that I think is interesting about the starting world is um, if you show a character interacting in the starting world when they're starting out and then interacting with the same group of people later or the same having a similar experience later, you can show how much they've changed without ever saying, look at how much this character's changed. Like if they meet the big bully and they're scared in the starting world, and then they somehow meet them again, like towards the end of the third act, and just like, I don't know, punch them in the face immediately and like don't get frightened at all. You effectively do like this kind of world building without ever having to like say, man, aren't these people, isn't this person so much more powerful now? Okay, so let's talk about the transition world. So this is the thing I think most people miss in fantasy. They go from, and we don't really talk about this in fantasy. We talk about it in video games, but like really not like when we're writing a book, which is like before you go to Mordor, like you need to settle again when things are very, very changed. Like this is a another way to get characters into a much different frame of mind and readers into like a much weirder situation without like hand holding them necessarily. So I consider this Rivendell. Like Rivendell is Frodo has left the Shire with three friends. They've met a weird ranger. They have fought ring wraiths. They have skitter. They have like been in constant motion, and now you need to settle and say what I don't like know everyone needs to know like what the heck ring rates are and like what all of these things and like what is happening. And this transition world is where we let people breathe again. Like the transition world technically happens between Hobbiton and Rivendell, but like when I think of a transition world, like I want you to be able to settle and see what has changed. And so often when we talk about structure, like it just people write just this like build up, build up, build up, build up, build into the big climax, and they never let their readers settle and think about what has happened and like get their bearings. And it's as important for the characters to stop and get their bearings as the reader is, because then you could explain what if Rivendell didn't happen, you would not know like the quite the stakes of all. Like you would not know like about ring wraiths. You would not know about Mordor. You would not know about the ring. You would just be like, okay, I guess we're gonna keep going to this big place. But the transition point or the transition world is where you you get your bearings on just what is at stake and how big it can be and how big that it will be without having to actually like fight the big bad guy. So like um things are very different in Rivendell than they were in Hobbiton. For instance, you get introduced to dwarves and elves. You get introduced to the king, like the broken sword, the Sauron story, you get introduced to elves, you get introduced to where the class barriers, like you understand that dwarves and elves and all of these characters are in conflict with each other with humans, that like nobody really trusts humans, that like it's very hard to like be around the One Ring without it corrupting you. All of these things, if you had talked about in the starting world, would just bore you to tears. like again, this is where all of the info dumping happens in like you could theoretically just write 30 pages about all of this stuff that I just mentioned, but like by having the starting world, which is where things are normal, and then this transition world where you're like, here are all of the things that just changed for you, and like letting the main character experience all of these things, the you're now telling by doing instead of telling by telling. Um, so I this is also where the stakes are set. So to go back to Lord of the Rings, like you know that like they have to get to Mordor. And basically, as somebody who watched the 12-hour versions 100 times, like I know that like right after the scene where they all say huzzah is when disc one ends of the special edition, where like you've now left the transition world and now you're about to go to beyond the quest. Um, so any new rules are put in place, laws the characters need, like whatever is going to be in conflict, like whatever conflicts you're coming up against need to be like previewed in the transition world. Um the something that like is going to like okay, so there's a thing in the structure which is like kind of like the act 2 turn where the main character gets betrayed, and like in general, you want to set that up in the transition world that that will happen if it's going to happen. Like if and all of this stuff kind of it's kind of like a preview of what is going to happen in a very small microcosm. So as I mentioned here, Rivendell, the hobbits are met by all of the members of the Fellowship. They're told what they must do. They're given the final stakes. Like there's a lot of info dumpy stuff here, but like it doesn't feel like an info dump because you are experiencing it in like the in throughout like 5 or 6 scenes. I mean, like literally when they're all sitting around that campfire looking at the ring, it's like that's as close to an info dump scene as like you can have. But like then right when you're like, I'm kind of bored, like you have Gimli's trying to smash the thing and being like, see, you can't smash it. You got so like it's kind of like a combination of like info dumping, but then also seeing by doing, which is one of the great things that a transition world can also give you. Um, uh, that I am a big proponent in writing that structurally you need places where the universe settles and people can have a chance to be like, oh my God, what did I just go through? Like to exchange information, to to figure out all of the new things, to build new partnerships, to find more new ways through. And like generally, especially if you're writing fantasy, like if you've taken someone from Hobbiton to Rivendell and then you just continue on to Mordor, or if you go from Hobbiton to Mordor, it's going to there's no place to settle and like understand all of the things that are going to happen. And also just that sometimes we settle. Like the transition world is a great time to just train your reader that like sometimes there won't be tons of action and adventure. Like sometimes we're going to like have a tea and like recover from our wounds. And by have so that is to me the point of the transition world. If you don't for some reason if you don't write fantasy, it's still like you have the let's take a romance. Like you have the two characters who have not met, and then they're both given they both have a starting place that they are at, like one of them probably doesn't want relationships and the other one probably is like a hot mess heroine. I don't know, that's just what always happens in romance books. And then like they meet and like there's a transition where like the world changes for both of them. And then the rest of the so like for instance, they meet and it's so cute, and then you find out that like they're on different sides of a rival project. Or like that transition moment is still like the transition world where like people are acclimating to what the new real real is, and then they go on to the rest of the world. So you can do this not in fantasy. It's just so evident in fantasy. Like you see it, it's everywhere in fantasy and in sci-fi. In sci-fi, it's like they're on the planet, they take a ship that's the transition world, and now they're in another planet. And like, so you can very easily break those three pieces out, but you can use this transition world as a way to show people what the new normal will become and set them into the new normal. All right. This is probably the slide that the area that I get the most questions on in this presentation. Do we have any questions on this now that is confusing? Because the next part is like the rest of the world once they leave Rivendell.
Perfect. Yeah. So I do have one question for you. I think you kind of answered it, but let me just read it because just to make sure. So they're asking if your story is based in a single town, would the various worlds be tied to the various primary characters and where they generally hang out? I think you kind of addressed that just a second ago, but I
Yeah,
don't know if you have any more thoughts.
yeah, so I mean, I think so. I'm trying to think about like Legends and Lattes, which is like a cozy fantasy thing would happen in like probably one town. So it's like you have the woman, the orc, she like buys this coffee shop, and like the world is like there's some problems in the coffee shop, but then things settle. Like and then she goes to oh man, it's been a while since I read this book. Because and so I'm gonna take that back because like I actually don't know this book well enough to talk about it, but like yes, the idea is where do people feel safe? Where do they suddenly feel um agitated to like action? And then like what is that action? So there would be different locations and settings, even in one town, that would act as the transition, as this transition point. And it could all happen in like one office building also, where like if you look at back to the office, like there was always like some random thing that like was the normal of the office. They showed the office, the show the office in like their normal setting, and then Michael would do some crazy thing which would get everyone like agitated into this transition point where like now they have to have diversity day, or they have to decide what their pizza party is going to be, and they now it's like okay, you've now been told the new normal. The rest of the episode is like the what I would call the rest of the world, which is things change and escalate in a way that is unexpected but predictable based on what happened in the um transition world. I feel like those words made sense, but you can let me know if they did not.
I think it sounds good. I think it makes sense to me. Like um, this idea that you're not like I don't know when you it is like you said it's really easy to see this in fantasy because we literally are transitioning from world to world physical locations, but in some places it's almost like like when you talked about the relationship, you have this relationship with these two couples, they come together, that new world is like how are people now that they're a couple, how are they interacting differently with the people around them, and that creates a whole new world, a whole new setting. Yes, we're in a lot of the same settings, but it's just a different dynamic. The way
Absolutely. And
people.
I would
Yeah.
say probably like the meet cute, the first to the first date area of
Hmm.
until they are together is like a transition point. And it takes
Yep.
probably like 15 to 20% of the book, the
Yep.
fun and games area. And then, but then it's like, okay, now the world has changed and we understand the rules of this new change. And then we head into the rest of the world
The
and
world. There we go.
what the rest of this like is going to be.
Exactly.
And we're almost a lot of times I work backwards. I'm like, okay, I know they're going to have a big monster fight at the end. And like I know the hero moment, and I know like what the internal character wants, and what the character thinks they want, what they need, and like what is holding them back. And so it's like they're going to overcome that thing at the end of this book. And like or they're going to be stifled by it by the end of this book because it's only book one. And then you can say, well, now how do I work backwards to the starting world of where they start? And so it's like, well, I don't know, maybe they're a desk worker, like maybe they're meek, like maybe they're too brash, like maybe whatever, what is their like thing that they have to overcome to become a more rounded human and hero? But like there's usually a very, very far place. I mean, in a good book, it's an impossible leap to imagine this person who like just wants to like pick flowers is going to like fight the darkest evil in the land by the end of this book or this series. So like we need to figure out here in the middle, like what is the transition from like Frodo accepts the ring. And until that moment, you're like, is he going to be the hero? Like, is he going to be able? But like the whole book, the series is like built upon him accepting this charge and going to Mordor. And so, in the same way, if you have like a lot of people will have their big third act climax moment, and then but like you can then work backwards from this. How I usually work is rest of world, starting world, transition world to figure out like what we need to know and what characters need to see. It's almost this transition world is almost like info dumping, but we actually like are actively doing it though. A great example again is of like Harry Potter and Diagon Alley. Like like Hagrid like gets Harry, takes him to Diagon Alley, and like you see all of the transition stuff. Harry, instead of saying you need an owl, you need a this, you need a that, like Harry's like Hagrid's like, we're now in this bookstore. You're going to need books. Here's the money. Look how much money you have. Like he could have just told him, "You're rich, Harry. Like our money system doesn't make sense, but like just know, like you have a lot of it." Um, and and then by the end of that point, then you're like, now we're going to Hogwarts, which is where the rest of the world happens. Um, it's very, very, very blatant in the Harry Potter books, is why I reference them. Like it's like there's no buffering between them. So the rest of the world then is now informed by that transition world. And if you think about this like a video game, you have this like transition world now. Another good example is like Assassin's Creed. Assassin's Creed, like at the beginning of that game, like you're not an assassin, you're just doing kind of assassin-y stuff to learn the ropes. And then you transition into becoming an assassin, and then over the course of the game, you perform more and more dangerous hits to like fulfill out the story. Dark Souls is another one where like you kind of know when you're like where you should go because it's the place you're not dying. Um, so and the original Assassin's Creed back like years and years ago, you would I don't know if they still do this, but like it would be grayed out when you couldn't go there. So like you would know, oh, the world is getting harder and harder and harder, and this is like even harder still. So the rest after you do the transition world, the that like rest of the world um can come apart in like chunks where it's like this is my level 2 boss, my level 3 boss, my level 4 boss, my level 5 boss. Legend of Zelda is another one that like is great about like okay, there's 8 things that must be done to get all of the weapons that you need in order to like beat the big boss. And so like I chunk it I'm chunking it so you learn a little about the world with each with each conflict that you do. So the question in the with this rest of the world is like, well, how I tend to think that um uh, uh in books that the characters the reason the characters win is because they were properly leveled at every point. So like if you die in a fantasy book, you probably were trying to do a level 5 thing when you were only a level 2. But like the reason why these fantasy characters win is because they're like the right level to defeat the thing at that time, just like you would in a video game. And so like how are you leveling your characters through the world? Because the world is always going to be juxtaposed against like what the character wants. Like even in a romance, the two characters want to be together, but like things happen to like prevent them from being together. One is they're at opposite ends of a merger. Like, oh, there's a girlfriend that comes back. Oh, there was a misunderstanding. Like at all of these things, like the character that the story wants them to be together, but like we have to break them in different ways. So like they learn how to become the characters that can successfully be in a relationship at the end of the book. So this to me is like the most important part of like the world. Like, how are you using the world to level your characters so that by the time they get to the end of the book, like they are the proper level to beat whatever the main objective is that at the end of the book. Um, One of the and this like here's something that I we talked about earlier, but like even if this is a haunted house story, like even this is House on Haunted Hill, like we are talking about the main floor, maybe the starting world, and then they might see some weird stuff happening in like the second floor. And then like they have to go into the attic or into the basement to like find like even more horrible things that are happening. You know, Clue does this really well if you're doing mystery, but like even if it's just one book, like you need to settle somewhere, then you need to show people what the transition is, and then you need to slowly ratchet up the stakes so that the characters learn what they need to so they don't die by the end of the book. Um, so, uh, sorry. So the other thing that I want to make sure that you understand about the rest of the world is that the rest of the world needs to be full, even like in book one, even if your book is going to be a series. But the advantage of a series is that you remember that 10 to 15% that I said could be unique. Well, like you start book two of that series already knowing all that information, so you can subsequently get weirder and weirder by 10 to 15%, so that like book five or six, you could be in like whole other portal fantasy realms, like using words no one's ever heard before or used before, but you can do it because you've slowly transitioned people. And so one of the things that when I consult with authors I talk about is oh, like you've written book five of your series. And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, like this is way too weird to be book one. So like let's work backwards from like a place that people know to get them to a place that they can be here with us and immediately understand. And this is something that happened with my series, the God's Risk Chronicles. I wrote this book first, and I literally had to design four other books because it was just too weird. When I say too weird, this fifth book starts in the apocalypse, then jumps 10,000 years in the future, and like is like a bunch like punching a bunch of gods, and like it's like action and fantasy where they're like fighting gods of all pantheons. And when I read it back to put it online, I was like, this is way too many. This is way too many like things happening in this book for like people to easily be able to transition. So like I wrote these four books literally just to get to where book five's weird level is. And so and if you look at any long-term series, like you're going to see the weird level ratchet up across longer series, especially like more recent series. Said like they didn't quite know this in the 40s. So like, Tolkien like didn't you're gonna like Tolkien didn't do this. Like he's just like made a bunch of weird things. But even he made it based upon mythology that existed already. Like he used a lot of characters that people already knew and then pulled them forward. So like the question is not just is this book bringing people along into the world in a way that makes sense, but am I telling a story that people can immediately come into, or do I need to map this to a larger narrative? And since we're mostly fantasy authors on this call, I'm going to assume, like we want to tell a larger story anyway. Like everyone's probably listening. Like obviously, this is I'm writing a 15 book series. Like, is there any other choice in fantasy? Um, and so one of the things that you should think about in the rest of the world is this the rest of the world for this book? Do we go to another world the next book? Like, how many books is it? And how do I make it? And how do I slowly dole out this information across many, many books so that by the time it's over, I'm not confused or I'm like into it? I have a friend who wrote a series, and the first book um, was Greek mythology, Norse mythology, fairy tales, and like five other things. And by the middle of it, I was like, I'm with you. All of these things, I love all of these things, but I do not understand because you're using them. I do not know how any of them relate to each other. So I was like, maybe this first book, or maybe what needs to happen is they meet one of these things and settle with one of these things, and then slowly get introduced to other like spoon-fed out stuff that you can then understand. So like you can set up dangerous places that won't be visited for 5 books. And if you don't get there, that's okay. Like no one's gonna fault you if like you mention something in book one and then you never bring it back again. But like you can do the bigger you build this world, the more it will inform the story, as long as you're not going to spend your entire life writing the Bible and not writing the actual books. Um, but like it is an interesting exercise to say, okay, here's what I want in my story. Here's what I want the rest of the world to look like. Here's all of the things I want to explore in this world. This is going to take a lot longer than I originally intended. Like we're only going to be able to do like this tiny bit here in book one. Um, so this is basically just the encapsulation of what I've been talking about this whole time. 10 to 20% of your book should include new technology, fantasy settings, something people don't understand. The series goes on. Every book in this series can ratchet things up 10 to 20%, including new worlds, new characters. Lost did a really good job of this across 6 seasons. Their thing was we like get into a new weird situation. We're introduced to a new weird group of people. Then we spend the season integrating with those groups of people and then at the end of that season, I am introduced to a brand new group of weird people again, and it starts. But like, by the 6th season, you're like talking about like smoke monsters and stuff. The first like 12 episodes are just like them trying to survive on an island without dying. So like they knew that they needed more time than just like that one season, and that they needed to keep ratcheting up the weird so that it could get to where they wanted it to go. Um, Another thing about world building is time frame. Like, what year is it? What time of year is it? How long does the timeline take across your story? Is it a year? Is it several years? Is it a millennia? Is it during a holiday? Like, knowing the time frame by which your story takes place informs the story. And I know some of you might be like, of course it does, Russell, but like also it is hard to remember when you're designing this whole thing that like, oh yeah, it's really different to be somewhere in fall and spring. And like if you're talking about a large epic story, you're probably going to have seasons that take place that take place during your story that are going to be different. So just make sure you have that. These are all just some other things that you can think about with economics, politics, religion. It's like social. What does the caste system look like? Um, what languages do they speak? How do they speak those languages? Like, is it a guttural language? Is it a throat language? Is it more like a romance language? Like the characters probably how the characters speak talks to um like how they act. They've done plenty of studies where uh when you have masculine and feminine nouns, countries that have like, let's call it a bridge, but it's like a feminine in their country, use feminine words to describe bridge, and when it's masculine, they use masculine words to describe the same thing. And like that should not be any different in, I don't see why. I mean, it could be different in your world, but like things like that really draw out like how many cultures, how big is the world? Is it an island? Is it the whole of a universe? Like, um, what are the cultures and customs? Like, is there anything that relates to seasons there? Like, how does the map and geography um change how people view the world? Like, if you have a people that are high up in the mountains, they're gonna react differently than someone that is like at sea level. um, what historical battles happened, like who was on what sides of the battle, and how does each side talk about like what happened in the social in that battle? Like, what are there hard rules for magic, soft rules for magic? I tend to think that, like in my books, generally, like magic is bestowed by the gods, and thus it is mercurial and pretty dumb, and like it really um has very little rules. Politics, like all of these things are going to influence your world um in ways that will change the axis of what you can talk about them on. Um, uh, the most important part of this is like keeping it logically consistent. Does your technology make sense? Does your magic system work consistently? What does the magic even mean? Like it can people be hungry in a world with magic? Like, what is that like? Can can people pull magic out of the sky? Like all of these things like that you don't necessarily think about, that if you they can honestly drive you crazy, but like just make sure as you're making your magic systems and at your fantasy that like it makes sense. And another reason why you don't want to put everything on the table at first is because things might make sense, but like they need context later. They might need to have two books of context before the magic makes sense. How does the setting inform the conflict? One of the things that that old Chekhov's gun. If you introduce something in Act One, does it pay off in Act Three? How does it? How do you show character changing through the world? We talked about like showing the same character interact with the same person throughout the course at different moments in their life. But like all of these things are world building, and you might not be thinking about the world building of it all. Um, I've said this now 3 times, and that's how important I think it is. 85 to 90% of the world should feel normal to a reader. They should have been there before. It should feel like they've been there before. Um, they should, new things should be presented in the first third of the book, in the starting world or in the transition world. Please do not change big rules in the middle of the book, unless it is integral to the plot, because then you have to start all over again and explain things. Like that's maybe a book two problem, but like let's keep all of the things that happen in the big changes happening in the first third to half of the book. Um, okay, how to avoid info dumping. This is my favorite one. If you don't need it yet, don't say it yet, with like very few exceptions to foreshadowing. Um, My rule for info dumping is that you introduce elements as the reader needs to know them. So I actually have a policy where if I introduce something early in a book, I will introduce it again the chapter before it's needed. And then I will introduce it right before the character needs it again, because I do not expect a person to remember that that some sword does something that it only learned that it did like 400 pages ago. So if you can kind of maybe like very small, just say, hey, this is like the sword of Rivendell. Like it will like be reforged when the new king of Gondor arrives. Then, like when right before that then it like is re-foreshadowed multiple times in the books. And then when Aragon needs it in book three, it is introduced like an eighth time of that series. So like I believe that if you are going to if something is intro to the plot, it needs to be like introduced as soon before somebody needs it to remind readers that it is there, and then um, probably foreshadowed very lightly beforehand. I would, if you need to info dump, we just talked about waiting to the middle third of the book, at least, if not the last third of the book, and keep it very as short as possible. Like I would not want more than 2 pages of info dumping, especially because at this point they already know everything that happens. Um, Overall, world building should be at constant odds with the character's wants, needs, and motivations. So, like, as you're designing your world, like, it should be designed to be a frigging nightmare for the person who's doing who's your lead character. It should just be torturous for them to exist in this world. Uh, not like bad tortures, just like it should push every one of their buttons and make them grow. Like if the world is not letting a character helping a character grow, it's going to be very tough for them. It's going to be hard to justify why that world even exists. In my Again, this is just my opinion. Um, the nice thing about a world, if you think about world and setting as a character, is you can now use it to instigate conflict with on top of the conflict that already exists from the other characters in the story. So you're already going to get conflict by the characters in your story, but you by doing your world building right, you can also make the world a character as well. Okay. Took a little longer than I thought it would, but I'm feeling a little crappier than I normally do, so I'm not that surprised.
Well, excellent. Thank you so much, Russell. That was incredible. Really appreciate you. I do have a couple questions, and some of them kind of go back to what we were talking about earlier. So maybe
Sure.
go ahead and go over those real quick. Yeah, and so, yeah, hope you get feeling better soon. I'm so sorry you're not feeling so well.
That's
For
okay.
fun.
At least I just get to do things like this in my jammies. So
Yeah, right. So I have here, this goes back to the transitioning world, and Ellen is asking, in in a time travel story or novel, I would assume, what would be the transition world for something like that?
okay, so I'll take Back to the Future. A transition world was Lorraine's bedroom. That was the you like Lorraine's house when after Marty got hit by the car, all of that was the transition world. So like it's a it's like the thing that settles the character on what is about to take place for the rest of the story. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it actually does make sense because you're working up to that point. Marty's working his way through this, through the past. Like he has no idea really what's going on. He's kind of he's orienting himself. It's not till he gets knocked out and he ends up in her bedroom, like, okay, we kind of settle down here, and he starts to accept I'm really in the past. Like this is really happening. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and you learn all of the things you need to know. So like you learn George McFly is a pervert, even though you don't know that yet.
Yeah, that's
Like
true.
you learn that like Lorraine has a crush on Marty and how gross that is. Like you learn that like all of these themes are going to be important for the rest of the movie. Um, and that like he's stuck in the past, he's got to find a way out of it. And then I think they talk about Doc Brown in that area too, so he knows like what the next bit of his mission
Yeah,
is.
that's so true. So true. Okay, and let's see. I think I got one more here. Um, and it goes back to she's saying, so the idea is safety to anxiety to action to resolve an issue. And so I guess she's kind of trying to map out this idea, like we start in a safe world, right? The ordinary or starting world. We kind of the character moves into something where they're a little more anxious, like transitioning, I guess, right? The transitioning world to action to, okay, I resolving an issue. I'm resolving a flaw, or I'm solving the big problem. I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Yeah. So what I think about the transition world mainly is that um it can spur action, yes, but like it needs to get people like the character can be anxious. So the transition world kind of quells the anxiety because by the time you're done with that transition world, you know what the stakes are and where you're going. But like whether you are excited to like go into the rest of the world or you're petrified of it or you are uh 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 reticent to do it, whatever that emotion is, like you know what the mission is and you have accepted that mission and are there is no turning back after you're like done with the transition world. Um, so yes, there's no like you can't not take action because like if you go back to Hobbiton, you're going to be killed by the ring wraiths. Or like you can't go back to 1985 because like you don't know how to get back to 1985. You got to figure that part out yet. So like there is a necessary action, but I think I would add like by the time you're done with that transition moment, like everyone is on the same page that there is no choice but to move forward. If that's what they mean by action and then resolve, then yes.
Well, I'm getting lots of comments here saying thank you for the presentation. They've really enjoyed it. Super helpful, informative, very helpful. So it looks like we had a lot of people really enjoyed it. So, but does anyone have? We can probably take one more question. If anyone has one more question, we can take it, and if not, we can wrap it up. Let me
Just
see here.
make sure to take the picture of the QR code so you can find
Yes.
all of my stuff. If you only want one thing to do, I have a course called Write a Great Novel on theauthorstack.com which goes into more about this when I'm not sick. And a whole lot more stuff about building an author career.
Perfect. Great. Well, they've got all that information. Thank you so much, Russell. Really appreciate you coming out and joining us today. Get feeling better. And as for everyone else, we'll see you all next month. Okay? See ya.